It's a great pleasure to have with us this morning Dr. Alice George, author of The Last American Hero, The Remarkable Life of John Glenn. The book was published this year by the Chicago Review Press. Dr. George earned her BA and PhD from Temple University. Prior to receiving her doctorate, she worked for 20 years as a journalist before getting that degree in history from Temple in 2001. Now she works as an independent historian in Philadelphia and is the author of several books, including Awaiting Armageddon, How Americans Face the Cuban Missile Crisis, and The Assassination of John F. Kennedy, Political Trauma and American Memory. And this latter book takes a fresh look at one of the previous century's lingering mysteries. During her career as a journalist, Dr. George worked in a number of positions, including assisting the managing editors at the Detroit Free Press and as deputy managing editor at the Philadelphia Daily News. Her acclaimed biography, which we are looking at this morning, examines the layers that formed the man, John Glenn, a hero of the Cold War, a fighter pilot in World War II and the Korean War, a veteran senator, a devoted husband and father, a committed Christian, and much more. At a time when an increasingly cynical world needs heroes, John Glenn is a brightly burning light in American history. So on this day, when we celebrate America's independence, it seems an opportune moment to consider the life of Senator Glenn, who achieved the rank of colonel in the Marine Corps. He formally joined National Presbyterian Church, he and Annie, by letter of transfer in 1996. And he remained a member in good standing here until his death in December 2016. John was an ordained ruling elder. And I know that some of you who have joined us this morning knew John personally. And so I invite you to type your memories of his life as part of our NPC Family of Faith in the Q&A box. And I've received a couple of emails already from folks, and so I appreciate those. But anyway, without further ado, Dr. George, welcome. Thank you for being with us and for the wonderful account of John Glenn's life that you have written. It is a real gift to particularly those who cherish his memory and think of him as an old friend.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm somewhat humbled by the fact that there are people here who actually had the privilege of knowing John Glenn, which is something that I missed. So I look forward to hearing more about him.
So that's where I'd like to start. I mean, you've written books about the 1960s, aspects of the presidency of John Kennedy, especially the Cuban Missile Crisis and his death. And you've written a few articles about winning public figures like Will Rogers, but this appears to be your first biography. And you chose John Glenn, who, as you said, you'd never met him personally. What led you to John Glenn as the topic of this book and your latest book?
Well, I've always been interested in the space program, and I remember in elementary school being taken to the school auditorium where there was a portable TV way far away on the stage, and we got to listen to what was going on with John Glenn, and that stuck with me. I also noticed when he died that all the headlines called him a hero, and that's not a word you see applied to people very much nowadays. And I thought the fact that it stuck to him so firmly made him someone special and someone that I wanted to know more about, and that I thought other people would want to know more about.
So you set off on a journey of discovery. Describe a little bit about how did it begin? Did you have a guideline for how you're going to attack this project, or just what were you working on? How did you do that?
Well, I started off by reading his memoir, and from there I found that he had left his papers at Ohio State University, and so I went there several times and did research there. I also I love the Paley Center for Media, which is in New York, which has all kinds of old TV footage. And they had all 9 hours of Walter Cronkite covering this 4.5-hour flight. And that was fun. I went to Texas to go through the National Archives records from NASA. And then I started looking for people who had known him, and I talked to them, and it was just a great learning experience. He left behind a lot of things that were important to him that I was able to see in his papers at Ohio State. And I think he saved every single piece of paper he touched in the Senate. There were so many boxes of Senate material. But it was just great to get to learn about him, remember what he was like at that age and what was going on at that time in his life.
So you concluded and titled your book that he is a hero, and you said that that's kind of what attracted you to him. So did you set out to prove that thesis, or did you decide that that actually was the case and that the headlines were not just headlining?
Well, I started out thinking that the book would be about the fact that he was a hero, but if I had found anything in my research that made me think that was wrong, I would have turned away from that. But what I found, what I learned about his life before he was an astronaut, and it all just made me more convinced that the title was appropriate.
So most of the people who knew John here don't really necessarily know much about his early life, and his early life and Annie's early life are pretty much inseparable, just as they were all their lives. But the history that you recite in your book or recount goes all the way back to a small Midwestern town in Ohio. Tell us about what you learned about John Glenn as a young man in New Concord. And I know some of you put in the book, but a lot of people haven't read it yet. So what are the highlights of young John Glenn?
Well, he was a very curious young man. He spent most of his life in his early life in New Concord. He was very friendly. He had a very full, adventurous life. He liked to try things that he hadn't tried before. For instance, he got his father to take him up in an airplane when he was a very small boy, and he was very committed to his church, the United Presbyterian Church. His parents were both elders, and that was a really important part of his life. And he, in fact, sometimes corrected his friends if they used bad language, or if they made a comment about how pretty a married woman was. He would say, no, she's married. You can't be looking at her. And so he was very much himself. He got in trouble occasionally. At Halloween, he and other boys would sometimes take people's furniture and then carry it blocks away and leave it on somebody else's yard. And he actually was seen one time by a man whose sign he had stolen. And it all seemed like good, innocent fun to him until he had a policeman in his house late at night asking him where that sign was. And so he learned a lot from that experience. He was a good student, but not a fantastic student. He really wanted to be a Boy Scout, which doesn't surprise me at all, because when he was an astronaut, the other astronauts teased by calling him the Boy Scout, and he never got to be a Boy Scout. But he and his friends created an organization like the Boy Scouts, so that they would have the same kind of rules to live by, and they would get the adventure of camping and exploring. And so he was, his whole early life, he was very interested in learning. And to me, I think I was most impressed by the fact that he met Annie in a playpen when they were both tiny children, and that he never dated another girl, and that he he stayed true to her his whole life. And that was just amazing to me. And, it's in small town life, everybody sort of knows who's hanging out with who, and everybody assumed that they would be married one day because they were so close. They officially started dating in junior high and remained so close. And one of the people I interviewed said late in life that they were so close that put together they were more than two people because they had such a strong connection. And I think that began in their childhood, and they grew up with the same kind of values. And most of the people in that small town did have, high values of what was important and how children should be raised. And they were products of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. The pastor who was here when the Glens joined in 1996 is a friend, and I reached out to him and just asked for memories. And he said that his clearest memory was how much John loved Annie. And that was just so evident, obviously throughout his life, but all the more near the end of his life. And and whenever they were here in Washington on a Sunday, they were here at National Presbyterian Church at 11 o'clock worshiping. So he was active in his church, and you also mentioned, I think, the High Y Club at the local YMCA. And this is in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, the YMCA is still very much a conservative Christian organization. It's very faith-based. And so I imagine that was a strong formative influence on John Glenn's faith as well. I know that you mentioned on more than one occasion how important church was. And I think for John, that meant Christian faith. I think that meant Jesus Christ. Did you learn other things about his Christian journey in your research, especially in these early years, that didn't make it into the book because there maybe wasn't a place for it? Or I'm just curious, if he wrote about that, he was not overly vocal that I knew of. What did you learn about his actual practice of faith along the way?
Well, I did learn, he was very, very interested in Sunday school and church. He took part in the church in the summer, it had a week-long rally, and he had participated in that. And he cared deeply about it, and he didn't mind other people knowing that. He was proud of the fact that he was a Christian, and he felt that he was on the right path, and that as long as he stayed true to that path, it would lead him to the right kind of life. And I think having that feeling as a young child, as he did, it never left him. It was always an integral part of him, and he was very, very involved in his religion and really was true to it all his life. And I think that started when he was a small child.
Yeah, I think so. It's a little bit of our arcane history that our current denomination is emerging of several different strains, but the United Presbyterian Church of North America, I'm pretty sure that was the denomination that the United Presbyterian Church was a part of then. And the old UPNA was a northern Midwestern mission-oriented denomination that was very serious, much more uniformly serious than some of the other more broad and more populous denominations. For instance, it was the the UPNA that sent missionaries to the Middle East. There's Protestantism in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, in small numbers, and particularly in Egypt because of the efforts of that denomination. And so that's my surmise, I suppose. Well, so John Glenn makes it into college, and his senior year at Muskingum, he has an opportunity. World War II breaks out, and he quit school and he enrolled, and he longed to be a pilot. That eagerness to learn new things, have new experiences. It seemed like being a pilot was probably the pinnacle of what you could do. How did he end up as a pilot, though? Because it was not the most direct. He couldn't go to the Air Force Academy. He couldn't sign up for the Air Force. So how did that happen?
He had always loved Charles Lindbergh and felt that Charles Lindbergh was his hero. And so when he got into college and the war was going on in Europe, but the United States wasn't involved, he was very interested in learning how to fly. And so he took flying lessons in college and got course credit for it. And so he had a lot of hours of flying in a small plane, which helps. When he applied to join the military after Pearl Harbor, he first tried signing up with the Army, and the Army, he took the pledge and they said he was signed up, and they never got back in touch with him. And he was very upset because he wanted to be in the war and he wanted to fly. And so he went to the Navy, and he went through the same process. And the Navy very quickly assigned him for pilot training. And so he did that. He got pilot training in at three different military bases, and then he became a pilot. And much of his military life was focused on new training for new skills as a pilot. He was very much focused on that, and he loved it. And other pilots would say that he was such a super pilot that he could fly up next to them and put his wing right under their wing and tap it, and it would startle them. And then they would look around and they, oh, it's John, because he was that good a pilot. And it was really something that he loved, and he hated it during the brief times in the military when he couldn't be a pilot, because he wanted to be in the air. And he flew his own private plane into his 80s until he reached the point that neither he nor Annie could climb into it because their knees weren't good enough. Yeah. But he would have flown, right up until he was 95 if he could have.
It sounds like a little bit of that high school Halloween prankster was in him too, if he's tapping the wing.
Yeah.
Good enough to do that. As a military pilot, you wrote in your book, he displayed a bold kind of bravery. Some might even describe it as being a bit reckless, both in the Pacific during World War II and then later in the Korean conflict. And along the way, he became a test pilot, which eventually made him eligible for the space program. And he was ambitious from the perspective of his career. And at the same time, he was a person of exemplary character, always devoted to his family. How did he balance that out? Pursuing vigorously flying and also being a good dad and a loving husband.
When he was in the military service, of course, when he was in the United States, his family could be with him. And when he was in Guam, his family was briefly with him. When he was overseas, he wrote to Annie at least once a day and stayed very much in touch with her and let her know everything that was going on in his life, so that they weren't missing each other in terms of communication. And he just made ways that he could fly that would not take him away from his family too long. So for instance, he volunteered for a mission in China that he thought would be a short one, so he'd get back to his family quickly, and it ended up not being a short one. But that was he was always interested in being back with the family. And when he came back from World War II, you know, the thing at the top of his list was see Annie. You know, he wanted to see his parents, but Annie was it, and that was what he was talking about and thinking about.
So eventually John Glenn is selected to the team of the first 7 NASA astronauts to be on a manned space flight. He wasn't the first to go into orbit or even the second, but by the time his turn came, it was decided that he would actually do something that the previous 2 hadn't, not just go up into the atmosphere and come down, but that he would orbit the planet. And he did that in those not quite 5 hours that Walter Cronkite covered in 9 in 1962 when I was in first grade. So my memories are not quite as clear as some. But tell us just in brief how you sensed that this flight and John Glenn being on it impacted this country and the world for that matter.
I think it had a tremendous impact for a couple of reasons. One is that although the Soviet Union had sent up 2 astronauts by that point who had both orbited the Earth, the Soviet Union didn't tell anybody but during the flight that they were going up, and there was no sort of experience of their trips. And the Soviet Union also didn't share information about this is what happened when this pilot went up, this is what went wrong, this is what went right. So Americans and others in the world had no idea really what going up into orbit was like. And in the United States, in fact, scientists were not sure whether you know, an astronaut could swallow when he was weightless, or whether his eyeballs would get misshaped because of the weightlessness. And so in a lot of ways, John Glenn was really doing things to prove to future flights what would work and what wouldn't work. And he was the first one that the whole world pretty much got to travel with, because at that time, portable TVs and transistor radios were relatively new, and people could actually carry them to work or carry them to school or wherever they went. And a lot of schools did have the TV on all day or have the radio on all day so children could follow what was happening. And Voice of America also transmitted it all over the world in 26 languages, including Russian. And the Russians, in fact, did not try to block the transmission on that particular day. They normally did try to block Voice of America, but they understood that people were interested and were getting details they'd never received before about what it was like. And NASA broadcast his heartbeat. They broadcast everything he said to mission control, like on a 10-minute delay, but they still you could hear this amazingly calm voice talking to you from outer space. And that really opened people's eyes and gave them a lot of new information that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And in that way, he was a true explorer, because he was finding out new things and then he was sharing them, and he was sharing them with the world.
Your research is what, belied by the smoothness of your prose, but your book has over 1,000 footnotes, and that's not to put anyone off, because you can read it by, and actually they're endnotes. They're on the bottom of the page. And so it reads just smoothly, and yet you have a rationale in it for pretty much everything that you have said. I'd like for you to read a section, though. We talked about that while John Glenn is up in space, meanwhile on Earth. And so this is kind of what the rest of us were experiencing, at least those of us who were alive at the time.
Okay. All right. Yes, the chapter is called Meanwhile on Earth. With their thoughts riveted on John Glenn, Americans came together on February 20th, 1962. They listened, watched, dreamed, feared, and prayed. With the help of radio, television, and NASA communications, Glenn's flight created a network connecting Americans, east and west, north and south. Through national broadcasts, a college professor in Miami, a cab driver in San Francisco, a millionaire in New Orleans, and a farmer in the rural Midwest had equal access to what was happening in outer space, as long as they had access to a TV or a radio. All interested Americans experienced something precious, a day like no other, a day that would change America's mood and remake Glenn's life. With the help of relatively new gadgets such as portable TVs and transistor radios, the singular historic event represented the most broadly shared experience in U.S. history to date. The New York Times' James Reston spoke for many Americans, calling it the greatest American ride since Paul Revere, and it was pure American from start to finish. Part Hollywood spectacular, part circus, part county fair. 3 times around the world in living color and news from heaven all the way. And people all over the world who had access to the same media became vicarious travelers, following the calm and steady voice of John Glenn, speaking from so far away, but sounding so close. From the second his rocket lifted off the launch pad, Americans cheered Glenn. The sands of Cocoa Beach, Florida were covered with 50,000 screaming people. Many had children on their shoulders. They jumped, whistled, or performed their own victory dances. With sand beneath his feet and hope in his heart, one man shouted, "Go, baby, go." Without having to read the New York Times analysis that it was one of the most dangerous trips ever taken by a human, they could feel the danger as they watched the fiery rocket rise. And they celebrated the man brave enough to fly above sky high. After watching the liftoff, much of the crowd sat quietly, thoughtfully. They watched the sky until there was nothing left to see except pelicans and seagulls. Gay Talese reported for the Times. As the minutes passed, they sat slumped over radios, listening for updates. They had chosen to be on this beach, to see the rockets fire, to hear the crowd as it thundered, to own a moment in history. But now, like other Americans and Glenn followers around the globe, they could do nothing to resolve growing suspense more heart-stopping than any story created by mystery maven Agatha Christie or director Alfred Hitchcock. What would happen next was a story that would unfold minute by minute. There had been no preview of this never-before-seen event, no opportunity to measure the odds. As one adventurer did his job, much of humanity followed his progress. Breathlessly, Americans waited with mounting tension. They clung to their television and radio sets, the Associated Press reported. Ralph McGill, editor and publisher of the Atlanta Constitution, was entranced by the rhythmic sound of Glenn's heartbeat heard during some of the coverage. Glenn was distant, too distant to see, and yet McGill could hear the steady pounding. He realized that all over America, in offices, in factories, in farmhouses, and city flats, there were hearts beating with this sound. All of our hearts contracted and expanded with that of John Glenn. Saul Pett, an Associated Press commentator, said, that at 9:47 a.m., when Glenn was set to blast off, we pushed with our bodies and we pushed with our minds, and we wanted, in the worst way, for John Glenn to go the best way. Go, 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 up, John Glenn. Go straight, go true, go safe. A woman from Cicero, Illinois, told the Chicago Tribune, "My heart has been pounding as fast as it could. I felt as though he was my own son." One commuter in Grand Central Station told a reporter, "We're all up there with him." Telephone and man on the street polls showed that residents of San Bernardino, California felt a personal attachment to Glenn, and many stayed up overnight to watch coverage of events leading up to the liftoff 3 time zones away. Some Americans truly lived each moment with Glenn, and the anxiety of that day was a communal experience, as the jubilation later would be.
Wow. That the comparison to Paul Revere's ride here on the 4th of July,
Yeah.
that's it's very moving. Not just a historic moment in space, but such a moment in American history, with all of the technology really being available to bring it on such a wide scale. So just a remarkable moment. Thank you. In a little bit, and really quite shortly, I want to give those who are watching the opportunity to ask questions or make comments. But before we do, I just want to bring up some reflections of John Glenn at National Presbyterian Church. In 1998, he returned to space, but on a Sunday in October, prior to the historic flight, he was invited forward to our chancel, and the pastor prayed for him and commissioned him as a missionary to space at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And many, many people still have a recollection of that. I'm going to share a screen now so that you'll be able to see something, as well as some others. This is a story that some know. Let's see, did it share? There we go. So this is the north transept of our church, and it's a cruciform transept. So this is the upper part of the cross, and these are stained glass windows behind it, and both transepts feature stained glass windows. The building is about 52 years old now, and so when we constructed the sanctuary, these were very intentionally put in there. We have a whole book about the history of the windows, which I'm not going to get into right at this point. But John and Annie always sat over on this side, and it's on the side of the pulpit. But it also affords a view of the other side, which is the theme is the mission of the church. And what some, but not everyone knows, most of our high school and middle school youth know, because it's on a scavenger hunt usually when they go looking. And of course, this is the outside view. It's at dusk. It's just a beautiful, beautiful window. But up tucked in the right-hand corner of the South transcript is, lo and behold, an astronaut in a space capsule. And so the Glenns would have a perfect view of this. And there's kind of a legend, an anecdote that one point a pastor asked John why he always sat where he sat. And he pointed up at the astronaut and he said, well, I think that's me up there. However, a very reliable source this morning sent me an email, and the reliable source is the daughter of the pastor who was instrumental in getting this sanctuary constructed, actually used to sit over there where John and Annie sat, and asked him if he was if that was him up there. And of course, and so John said, well, I like to look at it, but that's a Gemini capsule. That's not a capsule. And of course, he would know. But it's lovely. And of course, when the church was constructed in the late 60s, John Glenn had been up into space, but at the time he was still a very active member, I think, at Little Falls Presbyterian Church, which is across the river in Arlington. And Little Falls named their fellowship hall Friendship Hall in honor of John Glenn's historic flight. And so and then finally, in the epilogue of your book, you recount an episode that Steve Robinson, who was one of the astronauts on the flight in 1998 with John Glenn, and in the prologue or in the introduction, you mentioned that Steve Robinson, when he was 8 years old, dressed up as John Glenn for Halloween, and then he went up with him on the Discovery shuttle, and at some point during the 8-day flight, he encountered John in an upper chamber of the spacecraft, looking out into space, maybe at Earth. And John said, "I'm here at church." At John Glenn's funeral, our current pastor, David Rennick, was there, and Steve Robinson, it had to be him, was also there and came up to David and told him this story as well. And so that very much is the memory of John Glenn living on. One of our members, Janet, has this recollection. Senator Glenn was so kind and patient to children. My 2 star-struck young sons approached him after church one Sunday to ask him to autograph their bulletins. He pulled out a marker, signed their bulletins, and then talked with them for quite a while. They both wrote reports about John Glenn at different times in their school days and proudly included those autographs. That doesn't surprise you, does it?
No, not at all. He immediately after his Mercury flight, he started signing autographs, and he did it for the rest of his life. And he pretty much would do it no matter what other things he had to do. He felt he owed it to people to sign his name to that paper because he knew it meant something to them.
Yeah, I don't know. On page 252, actually, maybe it's the next page. You gave his daughter's account in your epilogue. Would you read that brief paragraph for us?
She talked about how he would go to a fast food restaurant and he would eat mush, and he would talk to the waitresses and the waiters the same way he would talk to anybody else. That was one of the things that a lot of the people who knew him said, was that he talked to everyone the same way, whether it was a king that he was meeting because he was an astronaut, or whether it was a cab driver who was taking him from one spot to another. He didn't consider anybody to be more elite than somebody else, and that was a central part of his being.
So I found it's on the bottom of page 250. I'll read it.
Okay.
John Glenn's children, David and Lynn, spoke about their extraordinary father. In your heart, Dad, Lynn said, you remained a small town boy, and you wore your celebrity lightly and taught us the same. Though you met presidents, CEOs, kings and queens, you had a common touch with people at a gas station or at a Bob Evans, where you and mother would stop for fried mush and scrambled eggs. She recalled that her father lived many lives in one life with honesty, grace, belief in our country, and the honor of public service. I'm proud and so grateful to say, you're just my dad. Thank you, Dad. I love you. Godspeed, Dad.
Yeah, it's a great quote. I was so glad that she did that. It's hard to speak at a parent's funeral or memorial service, but it was a great image of him as she saw him up close her whole life.
Godspeed, John Glenn. That was not the first time someone said that to him. Maybe it was the final time, but tell us a little bit about the history of Godspeed, John Glenn.
Scott Carpenter, who was his backup for that flight, said at the moment of liftoff, Godspeed, John Glenn. The funny thing is, John Glenn didn't hear it. The rest of the world did, but Scott was on the wrong frequency. And so Glenn certainly found out about it over time because a lot of people mentioned it to him. But at that time, he didn't hear it. And one of the things that struck me about that moment of liftoff was, that he knew he'd lifted off because he saw that the clock had started. And so that's what he was focused on in that moment, when the rest of us would have been petrified or at least concerned about what it felt like. And he was just calmly going along, which I thought was great.
So we have another comment from a longtime member, Jane Peterson. She said, we sat in front of the Glens for years, and when Annie had her knee surgery, we were standing around, and he poked me on the arm and said, "Look how great she's doing." Showed so much love for her. Again, just can't hear enough of those kinds of stories.
He was so proud of her when she got training to limit her stutter. He cried because he was so thrilled that she had been able to do that. And I thought that was very touching.
So do you think that John Glenn's life would have been heroic and extraordinary even if he hadn't gone into space?
I do. I think that by 1960, he had already had an amazing life. He flew 149 missions in 2 wars. He never lost a plane in the process, which he always said when people accused him of being reckless. Well, I never lost a plane. So he also, during World War II, got to fly with Charles Lindbergh, his childhood hero. And during Korea, he got to fly with Ted Williams, the baseball star. He, in the 1950s, set a record for the fastest flight from Los Angeles to New York. He won Name That Tune, which was a big game show at that time. Many people, if they had one of those achievements in their early life, would have thought, boy, I've had a great life. And he just went right on from there. His astronaut experience, he first Ohioan to serve 4 consecutive terms in the Senate, and then becoming the oldest person in space.
So Jane has a follow-up reminiscence that when he was going on the second flight, she says, I asked him if an old lady could go on with him, and he laughed and said, sure. And of course, he evolved in his thoughts about women in space from an early statement that, of course, nobody can say anything in their life without it coming to follow them. But he later was quite a bit more inclusive about women in the space program than he had been initially in the 60s. Just a couple of final questions as we move towards the end of the hour. You called John Glenn the last American hero. Why do you call him the last American hero?
I think right now, so much in our society is contested ground. The idea of the truth is contested. Some people say this is the truth, and other people say, no, that's not the truth. And I think right now, Americans would be hard pressed to find one person that everybody agreed was a hero and to celebrate that person. And I thought back, and when I was doing interviews for the book, I asked some people, you know, can you think of somebody recently who's been a hero? And it was no, for the most part, people had not. Sully Sullenberger, who landed the U.S. Airways plane on the Hudson, was one person thought of him, but others couldn't think of anybody. And I think it's just right now we're not in a place where, you know, even the congressional vote about honoring the Capitol Police was not a unanimous vote, and it's odd that we couldn't have found a way that everybody could have voted in favor of that.
So Glenn, another comment or question. Glenn was portrayed as a hero to the Black women in the movie Hidden Figures, the mathematicians. How accurate is that portrayal?
That is true. That actually did. It actually happened that he did ask the really great mathematician whose name slips my mind right now, but he asked her to check what the computers had said about his orbital flight, and that was the kind of person he was. He was open to different people, to different kinds of information. And at that time, you know, computers were not that old in 1962. So he did respect what she did and wanted to get her input before he got in that capsule.
Thank you. So you mentioned 4 times as a senator and some of the things that he did and didn't do. In your book, you mentioned that he didn't know how to do politics. So Eleanor Higginbotham makes that note that his senatorial career was not without problems. And her dad was actually chaplain of the Senate at the time. So I don't know that he shared anything inappropriately, but he certainly would have known. Can you comment on that part of his life, and how does that affect his hero status?
I think that John Glenn saw himself as a public servant, not as a politician. And he tried not to act like people who he would categorize as politicians for the most part. He, for instance, when he was in the Senate, and he would ask his staff to work late. If one of the women had to bring in their small child, she would soon find the child in John Glenn's lap, eating popcorn, watching TV or whatever, and having a great time rather than having a night when his schedule was disrupted. Glenn had certain issues he felt strongly about. For instance, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and he also cared a lot about efficiency in government. And both of those things are important, but they're not exciting, and they're not fun, and they're not things that would attract a lot of media attention. So he had that, they weren't exactly boring issues, but they were issues that maybe didn't attract a lot of attention. He also, when he did run for president in 1984, and he tried to make it not like anybody else's presidential campaign, and doing that turned out to be the wrong thing to do. But he went into it with the idea that he wasn't like everybody else, and he wanted to reach out to all Americans, not just the ones in New Hampshire and Iowa who got the first chance to vote.
I'm just getting a text here of an autographed little note from, there's a long note, I can't read it all, from Ken Levinson, who's the husband of one of our pastors. Just so many great memories of him. So in your research, what surprised you the most about John Glenn? What did you, something you discovered or maybe cumulatively?
I think it was his relationship with Annie and the way that it began. I've never met anybody in my life who's had that kind of connection from such an early age. And, you know, to never have dated another girl. I mean, that is really astonishing, but it showed what an amazing connection they had and how much they cared about each other. And they had a little ritual every time he went off to war or every time he took a space flight. He would tell her he was just going down to the corner to get a pack of gum, and she would say, okay. And that was, to them, that was a way of dealing with the fact that they both had trepidations about being apart, but he wanted her to know he was never really going away. He would always be coming back.
So sweet. So there's a reading from the last portion of your prologue, and I'd like it to end with that, but not before saying thank you so much for being with us this morning. We're not that far away from Philadelphia. If you're ever in our neighborhood, come look us up, and we'd love to show you the place where John Glenn spent his Sunday mornings in Washington.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Okay, let's see if my Kindle is going to let me see this. Okay. After Glenn's Project Mercury flight, James Reston of the New York Times wrote, "The examples placed before a nation are vital. What we constantly observe, we tend to copy. What we admire and reward, we perpetuate. This is why John Glenn himself is almost as important as his flight into outer space. For he dramatized before the eyes of the whole nation the noblest qualities of the human spirit. He credited Glenn with courage, modesty, quiet patriotism, love of family, and religious faith. If, as Reston suggested, positive national role models like Glenn can affect private lives around the nation, it stands to reason that today's leaders who abandon dignity, embrace prejudice, and display rudeness set a bad example for the rest of the nation. Their coarse behavior seems likely to be replicated in boardrooms, classrooms, and family rooms across the United States. Instead of studying the big events of the past or envisioning bold endeavors in the future, many Americans reside in a narcissistic and hero-free selfie culture. Demonstrating the courage to compromise is becoming a lost art, and the number of Americans who trust the government all or most of the time stood at 17% in 2019, down 60 percentage points since 1964. Physical courage still survives and springs up in scattered events. Nevertheless, the courage to do the right thing is harder to find in public discourse. Looking back at Glenn's first orbital flight, one observer noted, Glenn cast a spell on the American people that never quite wore off. When he died, almost every headline recognized him as a hero. This book attempts to track the making of an enduring hero in the hopes that he will not be our last. John Glenn was the kind of person America needs, a human being, neither perfect nor superhuman, but true to himself, his ideals, and his fellow citizens.
Wow. Well, may John Glenn's memory affect the present as much as it did when he was with us. Alice, again, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who joined us on the webinar. Have a happy 4th of July, and we will look forward to next time we're together. But for now, I want to say goodbye and God bless. Take care.